Asterisk, asterisk. Hey guys, tonight you slip into the dim-lit streets of a medieval town. The air is thick with smoke from hearths. The clatter of hooves against cobblestones echoes in the distance. And somewhere, a lute player is badly but earnestly trying to impress a crowd. You've probably always imagined medieval life as endless kitchen fires, at-home peasants stirring porridge, nobles waiting for elaborate feasts. You might even think fast food, in the sense of something cheap, quick, and hot, didn't exist yet. But here's the little reality check. You probably wouldn't survive medieval hunger pangs without fast food. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You picture medieval families sitting around wooden tables every night, tearing bread loaves they baked themselves, slurping their own cabbage soup. That's the myth, that everyone cooked their meals, and if you didn't, well, you'd starve. There's no McDonald's on the corner, no kebab cart, no pizza delivery kid risking life and limb through plague-ridden streets. And honestly, who wouldn't believe that? The Middle Ages feel too grimy, too slow, too poor to imagine grab-and-go meals. You think, asterisk, surely they weren't sophisticated enough for something as modern as fast food. But here's the twist. Medieval cities were buzzing with what can only be described as their own fast food industry. From London to Paris, Florence to Prague, cookshops and street vendors fed people on the move. Instead of neon signs, you looked for a smoky door or the smell of frying fish wafting down the alley. Instead of plastic trays, your takeout box was a hunk of bread shaped like a bowl. Imagine yourself stepping into one of these places. A wooden stall open to the street, fire roaring behind, a row of pies and pastries steaming in the winter air. The cook, apron stained, barks out choices: meat pie, eel pasty, or hot pea soup. You point, pay a coin, and within moments you're eating something that, let's be honest, sounds a lot like a medieval Cornish pasty. And don't laugh, but people were basically medieval foodies. Chronicles describe long lines at certain famous pie sellers. Yes, you'd probably have had to queue even in the 14th centuries. Nothing changes. In 12th century London, cookshops were so common that the city government issued regulations on how much they could charge for pies, soups, and roasted meats. Historians often compare them to medieval equivalents of diners. Some sellers used hollowed-out loaves of bread, called trenchers, as disposable bowls. After eating the stew inside, you could eat the soggy bread itself, or toss it to the poor waiting outside. Congratulations, you've just invented the bread bowl soup, centuries before Panera Bread cashed in. Historians still argue whether the fast food boom was driven by laziness, lack of kitchen space in city homes, or simply because workers preferred variety they couldn't get at home. Some claim urban houses often lacked chimneys or ovens, forcing families to rely on street cooks for daily meals. Others say it was just tastier than anything you'd manage in a smoky one-room hut. So next time you stand in line for fries at 2 a.m., just remember you're not the first in history to beg someone else to feed you fast. Medieval folks did the same thing, minus the fluorescent lights and ketchup packets. And at least your burger doesn't come served in a hollow bread bowl that's half stale, half soup sponge, unless you're into that callback. Remember when I said you probably wouldn't survive medieval hunger pangs? Yeah, unless you had exact change for a hot eel pie. You've probably seen it in movies. Long banquet tables stretching across great halls, nobles gnawing on giant turkey legs, goblets of wine sloshing onto embroidered tablecloths. The popular image is that medieval food meant banquets, only huge, loud feasts where people stuffed themselves silly every night. If you weren't rich enough for one of those, well, too bad. Enjoy your stale crust of bread. But here's the truth. Most people didn't feast, they snacked. The medieval banquet everyday idea is as wrong as thinking everyone today eats Michelin-star dinners. In reality, city life ran on quick, humble, and surprisingly modern meals, fast pies, cheap stews, fried fish on a stick. Think less King Arthur's feast, and more grab a burrito on your lunch break. Picture this. You've just finished a long morning hauling barrels at the docks of London, or maybe stitching cloth in a cramped workshop. By noon, you're starving. You don't go home. Home might be a single rented room with no kitchen. Instead, you head to the nearest cookshop. The air is warm, smoky, and filled with the scent of roasted goose dripping over open flames. A line of apprentices and sailors shuffles forward, coins clinking in their palms. For a penny, you get a hot bowl of pottage thickened with peas, or a slice of meat pie oozing with gravy. It's filling, it's fast, and most importantly, it's affordable. Banquets. Those were rare spectacles, usually for weddings, coronations, or the occasional let's impress the visiting duke party. For everyone else, taverns and stalls were the real lifeline. And while nobles might boast of feasts, even they, secretly, craved street food. Chronicles tell us more than one lord sneaked into town incognito for roasted chestnuts or fried fish. Admit it'd probably do the same if your chef kept serving boiled swan. In Paris, during the 13th century, records show entire guilds of food sellers licensed specifically to feed the city's workforce. Quickly evidence that banquets were the exception, not the rule. Archaeologists in York uncovered pie crusts tossed into waste pits near riverside stalls, basically medieval takeout wrappers. Imagine biting into a pie and casually tossing your crust into history. Historians still argue whether these shops were more like sit-down taverns or genuine grab-and-go kiosks. Some think workers lingered over ale, while others argue most customers ate on the street, rushing back to work before the bell rang. And here's the punchline. Banquets may look glamorous, but if you lived in the Middle Ages, you probably spent more time eating fast food pies with your hands than holding a golden goblet, which, if we're honest, sounds a lot more relatable. After all, how often do you sit down to a 6-course feast? Exactly. Oh, and if you think takeout culture is modern, just wait, because in the next section, you'll see how medieval folks treated bread and cheese like their version of drive-through combos. You've seen it painted in your imagination, heaping tables, mountains of bread, and endless meat legs, like every medieval person walked around stuffed after a 7-course feast. The myth says everyone ate huge meals every day, like it was some non-stop medieval buffet. But the truth, most people grabbed something so quick and so small it would barely qualify as a snack by modern standards. Instead of giant turkeys, you'd see a hunk of bread, a wedge of cheese, and maybe an onion. That was breakfast or lunch if you were lucky. Honestly, it's closer to grabbing a granola bar than sitting down to a Thanksgiving dinner. Picture yourself. You've worked half the day at the tannery. Your clothes smell like leather, and worse. You've got only a short break. You run down to a food stall and buy a piece of rye bread and a crumbly bit of cheese. You eat it leaning against a wall before heading back to work. No fanfare, no feast, just survival. The rich didn't eat like cartoon kings either, sure. They could afford elaborate spreads, but even nobles often stuck to a simple midday bite: bread, meat, and watered wine. Banquets were showpieces, not daily reality. Think of them like a wedding buffet, not your Tuesday dinner. Mainstream fact: in England, many workers were documented eating just 2 meals per day, a quick bite mid-morning and a larger supper in the evening. The idea of 3 giant meals is more modern than medieval. Monks often measured their meals to avoid gluttony. One monastery allowed only a pound of bread a day and 2 small dishes. Imagine calling that all you can eat. Historians still argue whether medieval people were undernourished compared to today or simply accustomed to smaller, simpler meals. Some argue famine cycles shaped eating habits, while others believe the food was hearty enough to sustain them. Despite smaller portions, and here's the punchline, the average medieval diet would make your snack drawer look like a feast. You stressing over late-night pizza. A medieval apprentice would be thrilled with your leftover crusts. Remember that eel pie we mentioned earlier? That wasn't a giant banquet dish, it was closer to a solo snack you'd wolf down on the street. So next time you feel guilty for eating light, just remember you've still got way more variety than someone in the 14th century chewing cheese and bread for the 3rd day in a row. Asterisk. You might picture medieval taverns and cookshops as exclusive hangouts for nobles, like some smoky, candlelit restaurant where only the wealthy could afford a roasted goose or spiced wine. The myth says that if you weren't dripping in velvet and gold, you stayed at home eating bland porridge. But here's the twist. Dining out was mostly for the working class. The poor and the middling folk were the real customers who kept taverns, food stalls, and cookshops in business. If anyone cooked all day in their own kitchens, it was the nobles with big hearths, staff, and plenty of space. But ordinary people, most of them had cramped homes, little or no chimney, and often no ovens at all. Eating out wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Imagine yourself as a carpenter's apprentice in London, circa 1350. You live in a 1-room rented space above a shop with 5 other boys. There's no kitchen, just a smoky fire pit that's more dangerous than useful. After 12 hours of work, no one is going home to boil beans. Instead, you head into the streets. Cookshops line the alleys, selling ready-to-eat meals, steaming pottages, fried fish, hot pies stuffed with pork or eel, even roasted nuts to nibble on the way. Nobles, they didn't need these places daily. They had private cooks and banquet halls. The real lifeblood of the medieval dining out industry was the shoemaker, the porter, the weaver, the doctor. For them, grabbing food at a tavern or stall was as natural as us picking up takeout after work. Step into a medieval city square, and you'd hear vendors calling out just like fast food staff, shouting order numbers. Pots of soup bubble, pies are stacked in wooden trays, skewers of meat rotate over open flames. The smell is irresistible: grease, onions, pepper, and bread thick in the air. You might even pass a bakery offering fresh rolls straight from the oven, sold for just a farthing. Inside taverns, things get noisier. A smoky room packed with strangers, ale sloshing from mugs, dice clattering on the tables. You order a hot dish, slap down your coin, and squeeze onto a bench beside men you've never met. Conversation ranges from gossip about the king to who cheated at dice last week. This isn't fine dining, it's loud, messy, and wonderfully communal. In 14th century Paris, records mention over 100 taverns, cookshops, and food stalls operating daily, serving mostly artisans and laborers, not nobles. Regulations capped prices to keep meals affordable for common folk. Some taverns offered meal deals with bread, cheese, and ale for a set coin. It's basically the medieval version of a value menu. Imagine ordering a combo. 1 trencher of stew, 1 heel of bread, and a pint of ale, please. Historians still argue whether taverns were more social centers than food providers. Some think the ale was the main draw, with food just an add-on. Others insist taverns were crucial for feeding whole neighborhoods that had no proper kitchens. So, the idea that dining out was only for the rich flips completely. It was the poor and the working who most depended on it. In fact, for many city dwellers, taverns were the kitchen. If you lived in a cramped house in York or Florence, you could cook about as well as someone today could barbecue in a shoebox, which is to say not well. Rich people might splurge on exotic spices, imported wines, or whole roasted beasts for special occasions. But the everyday restaurant scene was filled with ordinary folks snatching meals between shifts. Think about it. A noble might host 10 feasts a year, but a city cookshop could serve hundreds of meals in a single day. The math speaks for itself. Ordinary people fueled the medieval fast food boom. Chroniclers sometimes mocked the lower classes for crowding taverns instead of churches. One complaint from a London official in the 14th century scolds citizens for spending too much in cookshops. Translation: people were eating out so much it was seen as a social problem. Imagine your town council complaining that too many residents buy McDonald's. There's even a record of students in Paris constantly dining at taverns, much to their professors' frustration. One scholar grumbled that students learned more at ale benches than in classrooms. To be fair, a hot bowl of soup after lectures does sound more tempting than Latin grammar. And for all their pomp, nobles themselves occasionally slipped into town to sample the commoners' food. Writers hint at lords disguising themselves to eat roasted nuts or pies from street vendors. Because let's face it, sometimes simple food hits better than whatever bizarre swan dish your chef invented. So next time someone tells you dining out is for special occasions, remember, in the Middle Ages, it was the exact opposite. The rich ate at home. The poor went out. In fact, your average medieval craftsman probably ate at taverns more often than you grab takeout today. And honestly, that sounds pretty appealing. After all, who wouldn't want to skip washing dishes in a one-room hut with no chimney? At least you don't have to walk through mud for a pint of ale and a meat pie. Unless, of course, Uber Eats suddenly starts offering horse-drawn carriage delivery. Remember that soggy bread bowls from earlier? Imagine juggling one of those while bumping elbows in a noisy tavern. It wasn't glamorous, but it was the heart of medieval dining culture, and it definitely wasn't reserved for the rich. Most people imagine medieval food joints as chaotic little stalls where you just pointed at whatever smelled edible. The myth says menus simply didn't exist. No written lists, no options, no structure. You showed up, begged for food, and hoped the cook didn't hand you something suspiciously gray. But step closer into the bustle of a medieval cookshop, and you'd notice something surprising. Not only did choices exist, but in many places there were written menus or, at least, chalked boards and parchment lists. And even when writing wasn't used, vendors rattled off their specialties like living menus, memorizing prices and dishes with the ease of a modern barista. Imagine yourself ducking under a low wooden lintel into a busy London cookshop. The air is thick with smoke, and a cook shouts above the clatter of pots. On the wall behind him hangs a slateboard listing dishes: pottage with beef, eel pie, roasted fowl, pea soup. Each has a price in pennies, scrawled by someone with a shaky hand. It's messy, but it's a menu, and for a few coins, you can actually decide what to eat instead of taking whatever lands in your bowl. This mattered more than you'd think. Written menus gave ordinary diners a sense of choice and fairness. They prevented cooks from overcharging unsuspecting travelers and helped regulate a city's food trade. Officials in Paris, for example, kept a close eye on taverns, sometimes mandating posted lists of what was being sold and at what price. Think of it like a medieval consumer protection law. No surprise bills, no mystery meat stew, unless you signed up for it. Even in smaller towns where literacy was low, menus of a sort still existed. The cook would loudly recite his offerings like a street performer. Hot pies, fresh eels, stew with mutton and peas. The rhythm of his voice acted as an audio menu, drawing hungry workers like bees to honey. People knew their options before stepping forward, and prices were fixed enough to avoid endless haggling. Picture yourself traveling on a pilgrimage route, arriving in a small village at dusk. You find a stall near the market square. The vendor greets you with a memorized litany: stew for 2 pennies, bread for 1, cheese for another, ale for 3. That's his menu. It isn't printed on glossy paper, but it functions exactly the same way: clear offerings, clear costs. Archaeologists even unearthed wooden tablets with price marks in old marketplaces, suggesting that some stalls displayed permanent signs. Imagine a greasy, smoke-stained plank hung above a food counter with carved lines that roughly translated to 2 pennies. If that doesn't sound like a medieval fast food menu board, nothing does. And let's not forget taverns. In larger inns and hostelries, especially those serving travelers, there's evidence that written lists were provided to wealthier guests who could read. These lists described available dishes, sometimes even noting the presence of expensive spices. Think of it as the medieval version of a fancy restaurant menu tucked inside a leather cover. Except instead of roast duck with orange glaze, you'd see roast goose with pepper and cloves. Of course, menus weren't identical everywhere. Some were formal and posted, others were verbal traditions, and historians still debate just how widespread the practice was. Some argue menus were limited to big cities like Paris and London, while others believe even small-town cooks used some version of them to stay competitive. Either way, the evidence is clear. The idea that medieval people dined blind, with no sense of choice, doesn't hold up. The whole concept changes how you picture medieval food culture. Instead of faceless crowds being ladled random slop, imagine workers comparing options, choosing between a hot stew or a pie, debating whether ale was worth the extra coin. People weren't passive, they were customers with preferences, just like us. And there's something oddly comforting in that. You, tired from work, standing in line, debating. Do I splurge on the goose pie or save money with pea soup? Do I get bread on the side or trust that the stew will fill me up? Those little decisions, so ordinary and human, connect us across centuries. Menus also shaped social interaction. Sitting in a tavern, you'd overhear men arguing about which dish was better, teasing each other for ordering too cheaply, or bragging about splurging on something spiced with pepper. It's not so different from your friends mocking you for choosing the dollar menu while they order the deluxe combo. Humans, it seems, have always bonded over food choices. Think of one student in Paris, penniless but hungry, scanning the chalked list of dishes in a smoky tavern. He sighs, settles for bread and ale, while his friend goes for the pricier stew. The friend gloats, the student sulks, and both of them know tomorrow the roles might reverse. Even in the 13th century, menus had a way of sparking tiny dramas. So the myth that menus didn't exist falls apart quickly. They weren't glossy booklets printed in color. but they were menus, all the same lists of choices, written, recited, or carved into wood. And those choices gave medieval diners something priceless, a say in their own meals. Next time you squint at a glowing fast food menu board trying to decide between fries or onion rings, remember that someone 7 centuries ago was making a similar decision, staring at a smoky chalkboard in a cookshop. Their handwriting might have been worse, but the feeling, the thrill of choosing dinner was exactly the same. And if you're wondering, yes, there were probably arguments then, too, about whether eel pie really counted as a proper meal. Some things never change. When you hear the phrase takeaway, your mind probably jumps to brown paper bags, pizza boxes, or the occasional greasy paper sack balancing dangerously on your passenger seat. The myth says that in medieval times, such a concept simply didn't exist. People supposedly ate everything where it was cooked inside taverns, inns, or their own homes. No one would think of grabbing a meal to go. But the truth is, takeaway was alive and well centuries before cardboard containers or drive-through windows. In fact, medieval city life relied on it. Workers on the move, travelers rushing to the next stop, even pilgrims stopping for a quick bite. These people depended on food that could be carried away and eaten elsewhere. The to-go culture was not modern at all. It was deeply medieval. Imagine the streets of 14th century London. Vendors shout their offerings while balancing trays of pies, nuts, and fruit. A baker sells hot rolls right from the oven, wrapped in cloth for customers to carry. A cook ladles thick stew into a hollowed-out loaf of bread, handing it over to a mason hurrying back to work on the cathedral. That bread bowl isn't just a meal. It's a container you can eat when you're done. No waste, no dishes. If that doesn't scream takeaway, what does? Archaeologists digging through waste pits in York actually found discarded bits of pie crust and bread trenchers, tossed aside once the food was eaten. These were the medieval equivalents of crumpled wrappers. The evidence is clear. People weren't sitting down in cozy taverns for every meal. Many grabbed their food, ate as they walked, and left the remains behind. Travelers, especially, relied on portable meals. Inns often sold packets of food wrapped in cloth or parchment, designed to be carried on the road. Picture a merchant setting off at dawn with a pouch of cheese, dried meat, and hard bread tied to his belt. Pilgrims, too, bought food to take. Along the long, dusty roads, hand pies filled with meat or fish that kept for a day or two. Some were sturdy enough to survive the jostling of saddlebags, perfect for snacking on the way. Even liquids had their takeaway forms. Ale and cider were often sold in flasks or jugs, sealed with cloth. Travelers would fill their own vessels at taverns, carrying the drink with them like a medieval version of a refillable cup. Think less plastic soda bottle and more leather flask tied to your belt. In big cities like Paris, regulations even addressed the takeaway trade. Officials monitored stalls that sold ready-to-eat food for people to carry away. Complaints occasionally surfaced about vendors selling spoiled meat pies or reheated stews, proving that takeaway wasn't just common, but common enough to spark scandals. If customers weren't carrying food out, there'd be no need for such rules in the first place. Now imagine the sensory details. You, a tired apprentice, weaving through a crowded market. A vendor hands you a steaming eel pie wrapped in parchment. You bite into it as you walk, the juice scalding your tongue. People around you are doing the same, eating roasted chestnuts from paper cones, sipping watered wine from clay cups, gnawing fried fish skewers on the go. It's messy, it's fast, and it's absolutely takeaway culture. The practice wasn't limited to cities. At fairs and festivals, stalls sold food specifically for crowds who would never sit down. Travelers stopping for a day might grab skewers, nuts, or dried cakes to eat as they moved between performers and stalls. Pilgrims at shrines carried away bread, blessed by priests, half devotional item, half portable snack. Even soldiers relied on takeout from nearby towns, buying bread and beer to carry back to their camps. Of course, medieval takeaway wasn't always glamorous. Sometimes the trenchers grew soggy before you finished the stew inside. Sometimes the pie leaked grease through its crust and stained your tunic. Sometimes the ale jug cracked on the road, leaving you sticky and miserable. But for every mishap, there were thousands of quick meals eaten on the run. The demand was too great for it not to exist. Think about it. A mason working 12-hour days couldn't waste time lingering in a tavern. A washerwoman balancing a basket of laundry needed something quick, easy to carry, and filling. A pilgrim traveling to Canterbury didn't want to stop for an hour-long meal every 5 miles. The world was in motion, and food had to move with it. It's funny how familiar that feels. You standing in line at a food truck, juggling a wrap and a drink while you hurry back to work. Them standing in line at a medieval stall, juggling a pie and a cup of ale while hurrying back to the docks, separated by centuries but united by the same craving: fast, portable, hot food. Historians still debate how widespread takeaway was in rural areas, since evidence is thinner outside cities. Some argue it was mostly an urban phenomenon, tied to crowded housing and lack of private kitchens. Others believe even villages relied on takeaway during markets and fairs. Either way, it's impossible to deny it played a major role in feeding people quickly. And here's the punchline. Takeaway is not some modern invention of fast food chains. It's as old as the hunger of a worker too busy to sit down or a traveler too tired to cook. Every time you unwrap a burger on the bus, you're part of a tradition that stretches back to medieval apprentices munching on eel pies as they hurried down smoky streets. So the next time someone scoffs at your grab-dangle lifestyle, remind them that humanity has been eating on the move for centuries. You might spill coffee on yourself. They spilled stew on their tunics. Different mess, same story. When you think about medieval cooking, you probably pictured giant cauldrons bubbling for hours over smoky fires, or whole animals turning endlessly on spits. The myth says everything took forever: slow roasts, day-long stews, endless waiting. Food was heavy, sluggish, and never quick. But step closer into a medieval street and you'll see how wrong that picture is. Not everything was a slow roast meant for noble banquets. In fact, fast cooking was the heartbeat of city life. Vendors needed to serve dozens of hungry workers quickly, and they developed techniques that would feel surprisingly familiar to anyone who's ever ordered fries or kebabs at midnight. Picture a market square in Florence. The smell of oil fills the air as a vendor drops thin slices of fish into a pan, sizzling them to crisp perfection in minutes. Across the square, another stall skewers chunks of meat and vegetables, roasting them rapidly over hot coals. The sound of hissing fat, the flicker of flames, the speed with which meals are served. It's medieval fast food in every sense. Cookshops were built for speed. Instead of long, drawn-out dinners, they specialized in pies baked ahead of time, soups kept simmering all day, and fried snacks that could be cooked and handed over in moments. Customers lined up, paid their pennies, and left within minutes. For a worker on break or a pilgrim passing through town, This was exactly what they needed. Archaeological digs even uncovered frying pans, skewers, and portable ovens designed for small, rapid cooking. These weren't tools for elaborate feasts. They were built for the hustle of everyday life. One London site revealed layers of discarded fish bones near shallow cooking pits, likely evidence of a popular street stall frying fish in quick batches for passersby. If you've ever had fish and chips, you'd recognize the vibe instantly. Of course, there were still slow dishes, big roasts, and elaborate stews, but those were mostly for celebrations or households with time and staff. For the average city dweller, food was expected to be quick. Hot pies baked every morning were sold all day, ready to be sliced and served. Bread ovens churned out rolls by the hundreds, each batch devoured by hungry crowds within minutes. Vendors kept a constant rhythm: fry, roast, serve, repeat. Think about the energy of a medieval fair. Musicians play, merchants shout, and in between, food sellers rush to keep up with the crush. A fryer drops dough into hot oil, pulling it out. Moments later, medieval fried cakes, dusted with sugar or spiced with cinnamon. Children grabbed them greedily, parents scolding but sneaking bites themselves. It's fast, indulgent, and feels surprisingly modern. Even noble kitchens weren't always slow. Cooks preparing for large banquets often needed to serve dozens of dishes in waves, which required fast hands and clever tricks. Recipes from the time include instructions for thin pancakes fried in moments, or spiced sausages cooked quickly over coals. Not every dish was a day-long project. Many were designed to feed crowds quickly and efficiently. Imagine yourself as a mason on lunch break. You hurry into a cookshop, the air thick with smoke and spice. The cook hands you a hot meat pie, already baked and cooling on the counter. You bite in, steam escaping, grease dripping onto your hands. The entire transaction takes less than 5 minutes. This isn't the slow, patient dining of storybooks. Sits lunch on the go, medieval style. Some foods were deliberately designed for speed. Hand pies with thick crusts held fillings hot for hours, making them easy to reheat or serve instantly. Skewered meats roasted quickly because they were cut into small chunks. Thin broths and pottages simmered endlessly, ready to ladle into bowls at a moment's notice. If anything, medieval cooks were masters at keeping food service ready all day. Historians still debate how much of medieval cooking was slow tradition and how much was quick adaptation to urban demand. Some argue that rural life revolved around long, slow meals, while cities birthed a new culture of fast eating. Others point out that even nobles often demanded snacks between courses, pushing cooks to prepare smaller, faster dishes alongside the grand roasts. What's clear is that fast cooking wasn't rare, was essential. And let's not forget humor in all this. Chronicles tell us of students in Paris constantly raiding fry stalls, eating so quickly they burned their tongues. One even joked that fried fish was too quick for the devil to catch. The idea that medieval people leisurely waited all day for meals collapses in the face of scenes like that: greedy, hurried, messy, but undeniably fast. So next time you think medieval life was all slow roasted boars and endless waiting, remember the sizzling pies, the fried fish, the roasted skewers. Remember the vendors hustling to serve long lines of apprentices, sailors, and pilgrims who didn't have the luxury of sitting for hours. The punchline: medieval fast food was fast in every sense. You may have a microwave. They had trenchers, frying pans, and open flames. Different tools, same need food, hot and ready, before your break ended. And if you've ever burned your mouth on fries because you couldn't wait, You already know exactly how it felt to be a hungry student, grabbing fried fish in 13th century Paris. Some things never change. When you imagine medieval thirst, you probably see villagers lowering buckets into wells, hauling up cold water, and sipping it like that was the only option. The myth says medieval people drank water straight from wells or streams and nothing else. A glass of clean water, that's the entire story. But here's the reality. Wells were just one tiny part of a much bigger drinking culture. In fact, plain water was often avoided since it was risky, polluted, or simply unappealing. The true medieval beverage menu was surprisingly rich. Ales, ciders, wines, herbal infusions, and even spiced concoctions poured in taverns and homes alike. If you lived back then, you'd almost never rely on well water to quench your thirst. Picture a bustling tavern in 13th century London. Air smells of roasted meat and smoke, but what people hold in their hands isn't mugs of water, it's mugs of ale. Children sip watered-down versions, adults drink stronger brews, and the barrels stacked in the corner slosh every time the tavern shakes with laughter. Wells, they existed, sure, but taverns thrived because ale was safer, tastier, and social. Ale wasn't the only drink in apple-rich regions. Cider was everywhere, bubbling in wooden casks, poured into jugs for travelers. In grape-growing areas, wine flowed like the medieval equivalent of soda. Even imported wines made their way north, diluted with water and flavored with spices. A dusty village inn might offer a simple mug of rough ale, while a Parisian tavern boasted mulled wine heated with cloves and cinnamon. It was variety, not monotony. And then there were the quirky drinks, herbal infusions, brewed from mint, sage, or chamomile, served warm or cool. These weren't just for refreshment. They were thought to heal, soothe, or fortify. Imagine a weary pilgrim sipping mint water after a long day of walking, or a housewife steeping chamomile in the corner of a smoky kitchen. Not exactly, but close enough for medieval standards. If you wanted a drink on the go, you didn't haul a bucket from a well. You carried a flask. Travelers filled leather bottles with ale or wine, tied to their belts, sipping as they walked. Pilgrims bought jugs of cider at roadside stalls. Merchants refilled wineskins in taverns. Even soldiers on campaign carried their drinks because nothing was worse than stale, suspicious water from a ditch. The reliance on ale and wine wasn't just about taste, it was about safety. Fermentation and boiling killed bacteria, making these drinks far less dangerous than untreated water. People knew it instinctively. Wells could be foul, streams polluted by animals, but ale kept you alive. That's why even children drank weak ale daily, a drink known as small beer. It was light, nourishing, and safe. Imagine yourself at a medieval fair. Vendors shout not just about pies and stews, but about jugs of cider and mugs of ale. You hand over a coin, receive a steaming cup of mulled wine spiced with cloves, and sip it as you wander between stalls. It warms your hands, your stomach, and your spirit. Wells, there in the background, important for daily life, but not the centerpiece of medieval thirst. Records from Paris in the 14th century mention entire guilds of tavern keepers, with strict rules about pricing and cleanliness, that many taverns couldn't survive if everyone just drank from wells. These were thriving businesses, feeding a constant demand for brewed and fermented drinks. And they weren't just luxuries, they were daily necessities. Of course, water was still used, especially in the countryside, where wells and streams remained essential. But even there, people often mixed water with ale or wine, or boiled it with herbs. Pure, untreated water was a gamble. and medieval folks were too practical to risk it unless they had no choice. Historians still argue over just how much water was consumed compared to ale or wine. Some say water was more common than we assume, especially in rural settings. Others argue that city dwellers depended almost entirely on brewed drinks. What everyone agrees on is that the myth of just wells oversimplifies a far more colorful and flavorful drinking culture. Think of the humor in it. Students in Paris guzzling so much wine that officials tried to limit sales, or towns complaining about apprentices spending too much time in taverns. One chronicler even joked that the city drinks more ale than it prays. Wells didn't inspire that kind of gossip, taverns did. So next time you reach for a soda or iced coffee, remember your medieval counterpart probably reached for a mug of ale, a jug of cider, or a flask of watered wine. Wells were important, yes, but they weren't the main act. The real medieval drinks came with froth, spice, or fermentation. And here's the punchline. You and a 14th century apprentice aren't that different. You line up at a cafe counter. He lines up at a tavern bench. You sip lattes. He sips ale. Both of you avoid plain water, not because it isn't available, but because something tastier and safer is within reach. So the next time someone insists medieval people only drank well water, raise your muggle cider or mulled wine will do on toast to a world that knew better than to settle for plain. When most people imagine medieval food, they picture bowls of gray porridge, unseasoned meat, and bread so dry it could double as a doorstop. The myth says medieval meals were plain, dull, and tasteless, an endless march of boring gruel. But the reality, medieval cooks loved flavor. They obsessed over spices, herbs, and sauces in ways that might surprise you. Far from being bland, much of their food was spiced so heavily it would make your eyes water. In fact, the medieval palate craved intensities, wheat and savory mixed together, sour paired with pepper, cinnamon sprinkled on meat pies. Imagine stepping into a 14th century kitchen. The air is thick with scents, not of cabbage alone, but of ginger, cloves, saffron, pepper, nutmeg, and cinnamon. Traders brought these spices from Asia and the Middle East, and they were prized so highly they were locked away in little boxes. A pinch of saffron could cost more than a day's wages, yet it found its way into stews and sauces for those who could afford it. Even ordinary cooks used herbs like parsley, sage, dill, and garlic to keep flavors bold. One common dish, pottage, wasn't bland at all when made well. Peas, onions, and grains simmered together could be seasoned with pepper, garlic, and even a splash of vinegar for temps. Add a handful of parsley, and suddenly it's hearty, fragrant, and far from boring. Another favorite, meat pies, spiced with ginger and cloves, their flavors bursting with warmth. Bite into one, and you'd realize medieval food could taste richer than many fast food meals today. Street food vendors weren't shy with spices either. Imagine grabbing a hot pie at a fair. You bite in and taste pepper sharp against salty meat. Maybe even a hint of cinnamon if the cook wanted to impress. It's fast filling, but it isn't flavorless. People expected a kick. They weren't satisfied with plain boiled meat. They wanted zest, heat, and complexity. Of course, spices were expensive, and not every dish was drenched in saffron. Commoners used herbs grown in gardens, vinegar made from wine, or onions and leeks to add depth. A mason grabbing stew might not get cloves, but he'd get garlic and parsley, sharp and earthy enough to liven up the bowl. Even the poorest households tossed in what they could, wild herbs, mustard seeds, or nettles to make meals more flavorful. There's also the fascinating love medieval people had for mixing sweet and savory. Imagine roasted meat glazed with honey, pies filled with dried fruit alongside pork, or sauces that combined vinegar, sugar, and spices into a tangy punch. To modern tongues, it sounds odd, but to them, it was delicious. Bland wasn't the goal, surprise was. Spices carried status, too. To serve pepper or saffron was to flaunt wealth. That's why medieval banquets boasted dishes glowing gold with saffron or spiked with imported pepper. Chroniclers even joked about nobles showing off by overspicing their food, like modern people bragging about eating the hottest chili. Historians still debate just how widespread spice use really was. Some argue that only the wealthy could afford the imported luxuries, while others point to evidence that even common cookshops kept small stocks of pepper or ginger, used sparingly but deliberately. What's certain is that blandness wasn't the rule, flavor was, and humor wasn't absent either. Writers mocked cooks who drowned everything in garlic or used so much vinegar that diners puckered their faces. Imagine your friend overdoing the hot sauce at Taco Bell. Same energy, different century. So, when you picture medieval food, erase the image of gray sludge. Replace it with a bustling kitchen full of aromas, a pie bursting with cloves and ginger, a stew sharpened with garlic and parsley. Even the fast food of the streets carried a punch of flavor. The punchline: if you time traveled with your taste buds, expecting dull porridge, you'd be in for a fiery surprise. Bland food? Hardly. Medieval cooks might have loved their spices so much they'd laugh at our plain toast and call us the boring eaters. When most people imagine medieval food, they picture bowls of gray porridge, unseasoned meat, and bread so dry it could double as a doorstop. The myth says medieval meals were plain, dull, and tasteless, an endless march of boring gruel. But the reality: medieval cooks loved flavor. They obsessed over spices, herbs, and sauces in ways that might surprise you. Far from being bland, much of their food was spiced so heavily it would make your eyes water. In fact, the medieval palate craved intensity, sweet and savory mixed together, sour paired with pepper, cinnamon sprinkled on meat pies. Imagine stepping into a 14th century kitchen. The air is thick with scents, not of cabbage alone, but of ginger, cloves, saffron, pepper, nutmeg, and cinnamon. Traders brought these spices from Asia and the Middle East, and they were prized so highly they were locked away in little boxes. A pinch of saffron could cost more than a day's wages, yet it found its way into stews and sauces for those who could afford it. Even ordinary cooks used herbs like parsley, sage, dill, and garlic to keep flavors bold. One common dish, pottage, wasn't bland at all when made well. Peas, onions, and grains simmered together could be seasoned with pepper, garlic, and even a splash of vinegar for temp. Add a handful of parsley, and suddenly it's hearty, fragrant, and far from boring. Another favorite, meat pies, spiced with ginger and cloves, their flavors bursting with warmth. Bite into one, and you'd realize medieval food could taste richer than many fast food meals today. Street food vendors weren't shy with spices either. Imagine grabbing a hot pie at a fair. You bite in and taste pepper sharp against salty meat, maybe even a hint of cinnamon if the cook wanted to impress. It's fast filling, but it isn't flavorless. People expected a kick. They weren't satisfied with plain boiled meat. They wanted zest, heat, and complexity. Of course, spices were expensive, and not every dish was drenched in saffron. Commoners used herbs grown in gardens, vinegar made from wine, or onions and leeks to add depth. A mason grabbing stew might not get cloves, but he'd get garlic and parsley, sharp and earthy enough to liven up the bowl. Even the poorest households tossed in what they could, wild herbs, mustard seeds, or nettles to make meals more flavorful. There's also the fascinating love medieval people had for mixing sweet and savory. Imagine roasted meat glazed with honey, pies filled with dried fruit alongside pork, or sauces that combined vinegar, sugar, and spices into a tangy punch. To modern tongues, it sounds odd, but to them, it was delicious. Bland wasn't the goal, surprise was. Spices carried status, too. To serve pepper or saffron was to flaunt wealth. That's why medieval banquets boasted dishes glowing gold with saffron or spiked with imported pepper. Chroniclers even joked about nobles showing off by overspicing their food, like modern people bragging about eating the hottest chili. Historians still debate just how widespread spice use really was. Some argue that only the wealthy could afford the imported luxuries, while others point to evidence that even common cookshops kept small stocks of pepper or ginger, used sparingly but deliberately. What's certain is that blandness wasn't the rule, flavor was, and humor wasn't absent either. Writers mocked cooks who drowned everything in garlic or used so much vinegar that diners puckered their faces. Imagine your friend overdoing the hot sauce at Taco Bell. Same energy, different century. So, when you picture medieval food, erase the image of gray sludge. Replace it with a bustling kitchen full of aromas, a pie bursting with cloves and ginger, a stew sharpened with garlic and parsley. Even the fast food of the streets carried a punch of flavor. The punchline. If you time traveled with your taste buds, expecting dull porridge, you'd be in for a fiery surprise. Bland food. Hardly medieval cooks might have loved their spices so much they'd laugh at our plain toast and call us the boring eaters. When you think of street food, the image that comes to mind is usually something quick, hot, and cheap. The myth says medieval street food was always a bargain. A few pennies for a pie or a bowl of stew, the kind of meal anyone could afford without thinking. But reality, not all street food was cheap. Some of it was downright pricey, even luxurious. For every humble pottage ladled into a bread trencher, there were roasted delicacies that cost a small fortune. Street food in the Middle Ages had layers, some for the poor, some for the working class, and some meant to impress, flex, or indulge. Imagine yourself walking through a medieval fair. The first stalls you pass smell of fried fish, hot pies, and roasted onions, affordable dishes for the crowd. A penny here, a penny there, workers grabbing meals they could finish before returning to labor. But a little further down the row, another stall boasts something special. Swan pies glazed with saffron, pheasant roasted with imported spices, or candied fruits dusted with sugar. Suddenly, the prices jump. What looked like ordinary street food has become a luxury item only the wealthy can afford. Medieval sugar was rarer than gold in some places, imported from far-off lands, and yet you could find candied nuts and spiced sweets sold at fairs. Buying a pouch of these was less like grabbing popcorn and more like splurging on a gourmet dessert truck. It sent a message. You had money to burn. Taverns, too, knew how to make their menus tiered. For a penny, you could get a bowl of pottage. But for 10, you could sit at a table, order a goose roasted with cloves, and drink the better wine. Dining out could be as cheap or as expensive as you wanted, depending on how much you were willing to spend. Records from Paris list fishmongers selling oysters at prices high enough to mark them as luxury treats. Imagine the scene. A noble's servant jostling among commoners, carrying away a tray of oysters for his master's feast. The market offered something for everyone, but the good stuff wasn't cheap. Even today, oysters carry that same reputation. Luxury finger food you might slurp at a party. Medieval folks felt exactly the same. There were also festive specialties, dishes made only for fairs or holy days. These might include spiced cakes, elaborate meat pies, or roasted delicacies like peacock or goose. For the poor, fairs meant rare indulgence. Maybe they could afford a small sweet, maybe just the smell. For the rich, it was a chance to show off, walking through crowds with golden pastries gleaming with saffron. Street food became theater as much as sustenance. Picture a mason buying his daily bread and cheese at one stall, then glancing longingly at the vendor selling candied almonds. At 3 times the cost, he can't afford them, but the smell lingers as he heads back to work. Right behind him, a wealthy merchant tosses coins for a pouch of sweets, not because he's hungry, but because he can. That's the duality of medieval street food, both survival and luxury, side by side. And while many stalls kept prices affordable, there was no rule saying food couldn't be expensive. In fact, high prices became part of the attraction. Eating saffron pastries at a fair was a way of announcing wealth, like buying the most expensive coffee at Starbucks just to wave the cup around. People weren't immune to showing off with food, even centuries ago. Historians still argue over how accessible these luxuries really were. Some say most commoners never tasted saffron or sugar, while others point to records of small amounts being sold at markets, suggesting occasional indulgence. But everyone agrees, the myth that street food was always cheap doesn't hold. It ranged from penny pies to dishes that cost more than a week's wages. And humor slipped in here too. Writers mocked nobles who wasted fortunes on fancy street snacks when they had kitchens full of food at home. Imagine someone today skipping a home-cooked meal to drop $100 on a food truck truffle burger. The joke writes itself, and medieval chroniclers loved pointing it out. So, next time you picture medieval street food, don't think only of cheap bread and stew. Imagine markets bursting with variety, humble pies for workers, roasted meats for those with a few extra coins, saffron glazed, delicacies for the rich. Everyone ate there, but not everyone ate the same. The punchline: street food wasn't always cheap. It was a stage where class, wealth, and appetite collided. You grabbing a hot dog at a ball game isn't so different from a mason grabbing a pie, or a noble parading through a fair with a pouch of candied almonds. Different prices, different flexes, same timeless truth. Food has always been both survival and status. When most people imagine medieval fast food, they picture crowded cities, London, Paris, Florence, places where narrow streets swarmed with vendors shouting over one another. The myth says fast food was only for big cities, that rural life was too quiet, too self-sufficient, and too far from trade to bother with ready-made meals. If you lived in a village, you supposedly cooked at home and ate in silence. But the truth is, fast food stretched well beyond the city walls. Markets, fairs, festivals, and even tiny roadside stalls offered quick meals to people in towns, villages, and along pilgrimage routes. Wherever people gathered, food followed. Fast food wasn't just urban, it was woven into the rhythm of rural life as well. Picture a village green on market day. Farmers crowd in with baskets of eggs and bundles of leeks. Traders arrive with cloth and tools. And amid it all, food stalls spring up. A woman stirs a pot of thick pottage, ladling it into trenchers for hungry buyers. Another vendor sells skewers of roasted meat, turning them over hot coals. Children munch on honey cakes, their faces sticky, while travelers sip watered wine. from clay cups. This isn't London or Paris. It's a small town, but the smells, sounds, and speed are the same. Seasonal fairs made rural fast food thrive. At harvest festivals or religious celebrations, stalls appeared like pop-up restaurants. Vendors sold spiced nuts, pies, roasted geese, or even sweet fritters fried in oil. Pilgrims traveling to shrines relied on these temporary markets, grabbing food that could be eaten on the move. Imagine trudging along a dusty road, spotting a row of stalls ahead, and feeling your spirits lift at the promise of hot bread and ale. Take Canterbury, for example. Pilgrims walking to the shrine of Thomas Becket didn't all carry kitchens on their backs. They bought food from inns and roadside vendors. Taverns along the routes made fortunes, selling quick meals to travelers who had no time or energy to cook. A bowl of stew, a loaf of bread, a jug of ale, served in minutes, eaten in even less. Even tiny hamlets near busy roads had stalls to feed passing traders. A shepherd selling cheese, a widow baking pies, a brewer pouring ale. They all turned their work into fast food for anyone traveling through. For locals, it was convenience. For strangers, it was survival. And don't forget festivals. Think of a medieval fairground buzzing with jugglers, musicians, and merchants. Food was everywhere. Meat sizzling on spits, fritters dusted with sugar, ciders sloshing in jugs. People didn't come just for trade. They came for entertainment and indulgence. Food vendors made sure no one left hungry, and most of that food was eaten on the move, not at a dining table. Evidence of rural fast food shows up even in archaeology. Excavations in small towns uncovered pie crusts, charred bread, and animal bones near marketplaces. Proof of food sold and eaten quickly. Records mention sellers fined for cheating customers in villages just as often as in cities. If food stalls existed in remote places, that alone shatters the myth of only cities had fast food. Historians debate how common these rural stalls really were. Some argue they appeared mostly at big seasonal events, while others believe they were part of everyday life in smaller towns. But even the most cautious scholars admit fast food wasn't limited to cities. It was wherever people gathered in numbers large enough to create demand. And it wasn't just peasants who enjoyed it. Clergy, merchants, even passing nobles grabbed food outside the city walls. Pilgrim accounts describe bishops eating roadside pies, knights drinking ale in humble taverns. Fast food was the great equalizer, available to anyone who had coins, no matter their status. Humor finds its way here too. Imagine a noble grumbling after hours on horseback, finally caving and buying bread and cheese from a scruffy stall, or a monk sneaking a fried cake at a fair, caught with sugar dusting his robe. These moments remind us that convenience food has always tempted people, no matter how holy or wealthy they claimed to be. So next time someone says medieval fast food was only a city thing, picture a pilgrim on a dusty road, a farmer at a fair, or a villager at market hall with hot pies in hand. Fast food wasn't urban exclusivity, it was a universal craving. The punchline, whether you were in London or a hamlet with 20 houses, if there was a crowd, there was someone selling food fast. Today, we call them food trucks or snack stalls. Back then, they called them taverns, pie sellers, or simply that cook by the church. Different names, same hunger satisfied. When you hear medieval fast food, it's easy to imagine only peasants lined up at smoky stalls, clutching greasy pies and bowls of stew. The myth says fast food belonged to the poor, cheap, basic, and far beneath the dignity of nobles, clergy, or educated travelers. But in truth, fast food cut across every layer of medieval society. Priests, merchants, scholars, even kings found themselves drawn to the convenience of a quick meal outside their homes. It wasn't just for peasants, it was for anyone who was hungry, in a hurry, or craving something the home kitchen didn't provide. Picture a scholar in Paris. He's spent hours poring over Latin texts in a chilly classroom. He doesn't want to trek back to his lodging, so he slips into a tavern. The air is warm, mugs of ale clink, and a steaming bowl of stew is set before him. This isn't a pauper's choice. It's a student's survival. Chroniclers complained constantly about young men spending more time and money in cookshops than on their studies. Now imagine clergy on the road. Pilgrimages weren't just for lay people. Priests, monks, even bishops traveled, and when they did, they ate in taverns and inns like everyone else. Records describe monasteries buying food from town vendors, monks grabbing pies during fairs, and clergy sharing ale with travelers. Holy men weren't immune to the lure of quick food, even if they later pretended to frown upon it. Merchants, too, relied heavily on fast food. A trader passing through London might not have time to set up a kitchen. Instead, he filled his stomach with street pies and mulled wine before moving on. For him, fast food wasn't a symbol of poverty. It was simply practical. And then there were nobles. Of course, nobles had kitchens and cooks at home. But on the road, traveling to tournaments or visiting towns, they ate whatever was available from the same stalls as commoners. Chronicles hint at knights grabbing meat skewers at fairs or sipping ale in taverns incognito. Sometimes, nobles even disguised themselves to sample street food, the same way celebrities today sneak into fast food joints for fries. At festivals, class distinctions blurred further. Picture a midsummer fair, peasants eating fried cakes beside monks, merchants buying candied almonds, while children of nobles beg for honeyed nuts. Everyone stood shoulder to shoulder, munching from paper cones or bread trenchers. For a moment, food equalized them because hunger didn't care about rank. Evidence shows that some taverns even catered specifically to wealthier clients, offering fancier versions of fast food. Instead of plain bread and cheese, they served roast goose with spices, or pies filled with exotic ingredients like dates or raisins. These weren't banquets, but they were far from peasant fare. To sit in such a tavern and order a saffron pastry was to make a statement. Yes, you were wealthy, and yes, you still loved the thrill of dining out. Historians still debate just how often nobles and clergy indulged in fast food compared to commoners. Some argue it was rare. Others suggest it was routine while traveling. But no one denies that the idea of fast food being just for peasants doesn't hold. The evidence is too strong. It belonged to everyone, and the humor shines through. One chronicler in London joked that friars could be found in taverns more often than in churches. Another poked fun at merchants who tried to act refined but couldn't resist greasy street pies. Even noblemen, it seems, weren't above getting sauce on their cloaks. So, the next time you imagine medieval fast food, don't just see peasants in rags. Picture a bustling tavern with sailors, scholars, priests, and even a disguised noble sharing a bench. Food stalls didn't care who you were, they cared if you had coins. Hunger was universal, and so was the craving for something quick and hot. Fast food was never just for peasants. It was the great medieval equalizer, drawing rich and poor alike into the smoky warmth of cookshops. And if you've ever stood in line at a food truck beside people from all walks of life, you already know exactly what it felt like. When you picture medieval food, you probably imagine nameless cooks hidden behind smoky doors, stirring pots in silence while customers grabbed their meals and left. The myth says medieval cooks were faceless, interchangeable, and forgotten. No names, no fame, no individuality. But step into the streets of a medieval city, and you'll quickly learn that some cooks weren't just known, they were celebrated, mocked, praised, and even immortalized in song. Far from being anonymous, many became local legends. Their reputations spread across towns, and their names drew long lines of hungry customers. Imagine London in the 14th century. Along a busy lane sits a cookshop, its door wide open to the smoky street. The owner, known as Simon the Pieman, calls out his offerings in a booming voice. He's famous for his eel pies, so famous that ballads reference him. Travelers mention his shop in passing, and locals brag about eating there. Simon isn't just a cook, he's a character woven into the fabric of the city. In Paris, cooks and tavern keepers were sometimes mocked in satirical poems. Their names appeared in manuscripts alongside jokes about the quality of their food. One might be teased for overcharging, another for watery stew, a third for pies too greasy to hold. To be written about, even in jest, meant you were known. You weren't anonymous at all, you were part of public culture. And not all cooks were ordinary. Some gained reputations that crossed borders. A certain pie maker in Florence might be known to visiting merchants, praised for the flaky crust or the heavy hand with cinnamon. Word of mouth was powerful, and reputations clung to cooks like seasoning on a pan. In a world without Yelp reviews, gossip, songs, and poems served the same function. Archaeological evidence even hints at branded cookshops. Signs carved with names or symbols marked their doors, identifying specific vendors. Imagine walking past a stall with a wooden sign shaped like a pie, everyone whispering, "That's Giovanni's place, best meat pies in the city." Customers sought out cooks by name, not just by product. Cooks could also rise socially. Successful tavern keepers and food sellers sometimes grew wealthy, joining guilds, sponsoring festivals, and leaving records in tax rolls. They weren't invisible. They were part of the economic backbone of their cities. Some passed their businesses to children, creating small dynasties of piesellers or innkeepers. Their names lived on for generations. Of course, not every cook was loved. Some became infamous instead. Chroniclers wrote about sellers who cheated customers, watered down ale, or used bad meat. Their names were remembered too, but in shame. Just like today, a bad review spread fast. If a tavern gave someone food poisoning, word raced through the neighborhood, and that cook's reputation could collapse overnight. Fame and infamy went hand in hand. Humor colored these reputations. Medieval plays often featured comic cooks, loud, greedy, sometimes bumbling, because audiences recognized the type. Everyone had dealt with a cook who exaggerated his portions, boasted about his pies, or flirted with customers. To laugh at a cook on stage was to laugh at someone real. Historians still debate how famous cooks could really become. Were they local celebrities, or just popular among their immediate neighbors? Some argue their fame was exaggerated by chroniclers, while others point to repeated mentions across documents as proof that certain names truly endured. Either way, the evidence is clear. Medieval cooks were not invisible. They had reputations, personalities, and legacies. Picture yourself entering a tavern in York. The moment you step in, a man at the bench nudges you and whispers, "Try Agnes's Pies Best in the City." Agnes herself stands behind the counter, apron flour-dusted, grinning at the long line of loyal customers. She isn't anonymous. She's the reason people keep coming back. Or imagine a fairground in Germany. A singer strums a lute, belting out a comic ballad about Hans the Friar, who burned fish but still charmed every customer with his jokes. People laugh, nudge each other, and look around to see if Hans is actually there. His name lingers long after the fair ends. So next time you think medieval cooks were faceless, think again. They were shouted about in poems, teased in plays, praised in gossip, and sometimes feared for their bad stew. They were part of daily life, as recognizable as the barber, the priest, or the blacksmith. The punchline: medieval cooks were the original local celebrities. Their names may not fill history books, but for the people of their towns, they were unforgettable. And if you've ever had a favorite food truck or diner where the cook knows your order, you already know the feeling. Food isn't anonymous, it's personal. It always has been. It's tempting to think that medieval fast food was a quirky phase, a strange experiment that disappeared once the Renaissance dawned. The myth says fast food belonged to the past: pie stalls, ale benches, and cookshops, fading into history as people embraced more refined dining. But the truth is, fast food never vanished. It simply transformed, evolving into inns, taverns, coffeehouses, and eventually restaurants. What you grab from a drive-thru today traces its roots directly to those smoky medieval stalls. Picture the 16th century. Cities grow larger, trade flows richer, and taverns multiply. Instead of vanishing, food stalls expand into permanent establishments. Inns along major roads offer not just lodging but ready meals, soups, roasts, bread, and ale for travelers who couldn't or wouldn't cook. In cities, cookshops evolve into proto-restaurants, places where meals are sold to anyone with coins. Far from dying, fast food adapts. The invention of the printing press spreads recipe books and food guides. People begin writing about famous taverns, praising their pies, or mocking their watery ale. If medieval cooks were sung about in poems, early modern ones were reviewed in print. Reputation mattered more than ever, and fast food culture thrived on it. By the 17th century, coffeehouses bloom across Europe, especially in London. They aren't just about coffee, they're about quick food, too: pastries, bread, cheese, and pies. The tradition of gathering, eating quickly, and moving on continues, only now with caffeine. Travelers note that a man could walk into a coffeehouse, order a roll and a cup, and be back on the street in minutes. Does that sound like something that vanished? Not at all. Even in rural areas, fairs and festivals kept the old habits alive. Stalls selling fried cakes, nuts, and roasted meats still drew crowds. Soldiers on campaigns relied on the same portable meals their ancestors had: pies, trenchers, flasks of ale. Takeaway never disappeared, simply traveled with the times. Historians still debate which country birthed the first true restaurant. Some point to France in the 18th century, where refined establishments began offering menus and table service. But even there, the DNA of medieval cookshops is obvious. Quick meals, public dining, choice, and convenience, all of it was borrowed from the past. Restaurants didn't spring out of nowhere. They evolved from centuries of fast food culture. And when industrialization came, the pace only quickened. Workers in factories needed cheap, fast meals. Taverns, lunchrooms, and eventually fast food chains met the demand. The myth that medieval fast food vanished couldn't be more wrong. It never stopped, simply put on new clothes. So next time you hold a paper cup of coffee or unwrap a burger, realize you're participating in a tradition older than you. Think, a mason in 13th century London, a pilgrim on the road to Canterbury, a scholar in a Paris tavern. They'd all understand the appeal instantly. Hot, quick, filling, and shared with strangers. The details change, but the hunger stays the same. And here's the punchline. Fast food didn't vanish after the Middle Ages. It's still with us, disguised in neon signs and drive-through windows. We just gave it different names. Now, as the noise of medieval streets fades from your imagination, let the clatter of mugs and the shouts of vendors grow distant. The pies are eaten, the stalls close their shutters, and the smoky air cools as night settles over cobblestone alleys. You've walked through centuries of flavor, from trenchers filled with stew to spiced pies glowing gold with saffron, from taverns buzzing with laughter to pilgrims clutching bread on lonely roads. But now it's time to set down the imagery. Let the warmth of roasted meat and the sweetness of honeyed cakes drift away. Like the scent of a fair, once the crowds have gone home, the streets grow quieter, the tavern benches empty, the last embers in the cookshop's hearth dim to ash. You rest in that silence, knowing the myths have been peeled away. Medieval fast food wasn't absent, wasn't bland, wasn't just for peasants, and it certainly didn't vanish. It lives on in the simple truth that people, no matter the century, have always longed for food that was quick, warm, and shared. As you drift toward sleep, imagine yourself leaning back on a wooden bench, full and content, the hum of voices turning to a lull. A faint breeze moves through the narrow streets, carrying the last scent of spiced wine and fresh bread. The stars above medieval rooftops glow softly, as if watching over the end of your journey. Breathe deeply, slow and steady. The journey is complete, the myths are gone, the story is told, and you, like countless travelers before you, can finally rest warm, satisfied, and ready to dream.